Let's read Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy. If you, O Lord, kept a record of sins, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness. Therefore you are feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in his word I put my hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning, more than watchmen wait for the morning. O Israel, put your hope in the Lord, for with the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. So we are starting a new series today that will take us until the end of the summer. The series is called Psalms of Disorientation, which is a term coined by Walter Brueggemann to refer to the Psalms in which the person writing the Psalm is writing from a place of disorientation, a place in which he is unsettled. Things aren't right within himself. And so with these Psalms of disorientation, we find some pretty dark emotions surface, like anger and despair, contempt, jealousy, depression. And so we're going to explore all those Psalms throughout the summer. I know it doesn't sound like a very bright, sunshiny, summer patio kind of series, but whether we choose to focus on these Psalms or these emotions or not, these emotions are there for many of us, and they're real. And we don't have the luxury to choose to not feel them. And many of us do seem to be a little on edge lately, don't we? Whether it's people driving on the road or in the store or on social media, these heavy emotions seem close to the surface. And so it might be wise for us to spend some time with these poems, prayers that effectively guide us through these emotions, that give us permission to be nakedly honest before God. John Calvin called the Psalms a mirror of the soul, because in the Psalms we see ourselves. And if we prefer to skip over these Psalms that express things such as anger, contempt, and such, we are choosing to ignore the ugly parts of ourselves. And when we do that, our blind spots become larger and larger. And what Psalms of disorientation do is they encourage us to get in touch with the cry of the soul that is deep within the dark recesses of ourselves and vomit them out into the daylight. And so today is an introduction into the series. I'll be encouraging us to read through the Psalms throughout the summer. And so I want to say some things that will help us, hopefully help us, to read the Psalms the way that they were perhaps meant to be read, or at least help us read the Psalms. And I'm going to use Psalm 130 as to illustrate some of these points. And so here's the 4 points I want to make today. Number one, the Psalms of disorientation reveal the depth of our struggle with God himself. Number two, all the prayers are meant to be prayed by all the people. 3, the Psalms are meant to be prayed, spoken, sung out loud. And 4, the Psalms are meant to be memorized. So, number one, the Psalms of disorientation reveal the depth of our struggle with God. Psalm 130 verse 1 begins, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord." That cry, whatever it may be, that cry from deep within is a cry that is ultimately to God. If you are angry, if you are sad, if you feel contempt or despair or fear, the pathway of healing for you, for all of us, is at some point becoming aware that these emotions reveal our struggle with God as well. And that's hard for many of us to hear, because we think that if we struggle with God, we're being unfaithful or unspiritual, but think about it more deeply. We are all broken. We all have darkness within us. And so the only way toward healing is exposure. And so rather than suffer the illusion that we are being more spiritual by not expressing anger or despair or so forth, we are encouraged to unearth these emotions and direct them at God because He is the one in control. That's the underlying presupposition of the Psalms. My supposition, I confess, has almost always been the opposite, that my anger at that person has very little to do with God. I mean, I can pray to God to help him, for Him to help me process my anger with that person and so forth. But I'm angry at that person. I'm not angry at God or that situation. And so we tend to see, or I've tended at least to see things mostly on the horizontal and not on the vertical with God. I see it on the vertical with God as far as He can help me with my anger with that person, or my fear of that situation, or my contempt or my jealousy. But I haven't always translated that into this. I'm actually feeling those things towards God as well. But when you read the Psalms, you quickly come to realize that the writers don't have that same presupposition. For them, every emotion we feel on a horizontal level is also vertical. As one person put it, the Psalms disrupt our pretense that our anger and fear are not directed against God. It's God with whom we have a problem. And this is why God invites us to speak to Him first and foremost. Jesus on the cross prays, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Not, why have all these people forsaken me? But why have you forsaken me? Dan Allender and Tremper Longman wrote a book a while back entitled The Cry of the Soul, How Our Emotions Reveal Our Deepest Questions About God. And Dan Allender is a counselor, and he tells a story about how a friend once said to him, "I feel like I'm part of a cosmic county fair bumper car ride. I know I'm going to get hit. It's only a matter of when and how hard." And I asked him if his sense of dread was related to God, and he just said, "Not really. I just wonder when I'm going to get knocked down again." But Allender says, all dread is related to the question, is life predictable? All anger is related to the question, is life just? And then he invites us to change the word life to God and find how this makes the questions much more personal, how stuff gets real when you do this. Is God predictable? Is God just? And so, like the psalmist and like Jesus, go to God first and foremost with those disturbing questions. God expects it. When the psalmist wrote words of anger, for instance, and directed them toward God, it's as if God said, that should be written down and passed on to generation after generation for humans to use when they pray to me. God honors those words. Words like this from Psalm 28, "You, Lord, have taken from me my closest friends and have made me repulsive to them." You've done that, Lord. Or from Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Or Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And so that's the first thing I think that Psalm 130 directs us towards. Our unsettled emotions reveal our struggle with God first and foremost. And so go to God with them. Out of the depths I cry to you, O God. And the second thing is this. All the Psalms are meant to be prayed by all the people. The Psalms are written from a very individual perspective. So Psalm 130 again. Out of the depths I cry. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry. I wait for the Lord more. My soul waits more than watchmen wait for the morning. And so, and this is typical of of many of the Psalms, spoken from the first person, very personal. And yet, the Psalms have functioned over the years by both Jewish people and Christians as a communal prayer book, used in the gathering of people together. And so, we are meant to seek identification with all the Psalms, if not directly, then through our brother or sister. And if you've ever read the Psalms or prayed through the Psalms, you know that it can feel a little hit and miss. I've had that often where I'm like, I'm not totally resonating with this psalm. I don't find it particularly helpful for me right now. And then just skip over to the next one. Especially those psalms that wish for enemies to be destroyed, or the wicked to trip and break their neck, or something like that, or for the children to get sick and die, kind of thing. I usually feel, I'm not sure I want to pray that, and I think I'll just move along. Until I heard something that completely changed my view, and consequently completely changed how I read and pray the Psalms, which is this: ask the question, if it's not your voice, whose voice is it? This phrase comes from John Whitfleet. If it's not your voice, whose voice is it? If you don't wish for your enemies' children to be smashed against a rock, Psalm 137, then who does? If you aren't completely powerless to do anything about the horrific oppression executed against you and your children day after day, generation after generation, then who is? You might not identify with those words, but you do have brothers and sisters that do identify with these words. And by praying these words, you identify with them. And this could be the first step of experiencing empathy for the oppressed. And sometimes we might even find that if we are not the ones being oppressed, we're the ones doing the oppressing. Praying these Psalms does have the power to shape our ethics, because all good ethics and all good laws against injustice are rooted in empathy. When the people with the power, the people with the privilege, have empathy. If people with power and privilege prayed the Psalms every day, the world would change for the better. All the Psalms, not just the Psalms that make us feel nice, all the Psalms are meant to be prayed by all the people. And third point, the Psalms are meant to be spoken, prayed, sung out loud. So if the last point is that the Psalms help us stand in solidarity with one another, then this point is that this is particularly true when the Psalms are spoken, prayed, sung out loud. And thankfully, we aren't stuck without options if we're not allowed to sing the Psalms. Speaking them or praying them is just fine. We are not being persecuted. Speech act theory tells us that when we speak words out loud, they have more influence upon ourselves. And the Psalms were intended to be recited out loud, recited in the worship assembly or at the festivals. When we read something, for instance, or listen to something, it's much easier for us to just dismiss it. We can discard a book. We can listen to a fine sermon and then choose to dismiss it. But the Psalms are different. And it's different when you read and when you speak out loud the Psalms. If you choose to speak the Psalm, you are at some level either committing to it or choosing to be a person that lacks integrity, or perhaps most likely in between, somewhere in between there, put into a place of questioning your own resolve. So for example, Psalm 130 again. I wait for the Lord, my whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning, more than watchmen wait for the morning. When you just read that, or just listen to me say that, it's one thing. But it's different when you choose to put those words on your own lips. It gives you pause because you are declaring something about yourself. And the question is it true? I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. Do I? Do I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning? Because I'm saying that I do. When you speak it out loud, it changes things. It changes situations. Or also in Psalm 130, another example. If you, O Lord, kept a record of sins, who could stand? How good would it be for us to speak those words in unison together? How good for those words to regularly be on our lips and hearts these days when we are so quick to cast judgment on other people and cancel them, often appropriately so, but even still, if you kept a record of sin, O Lord, who could stand? Not me. I mean, that when we indwell that statement, the very thing that ought to come up within us is, not me, not me. I could not stand. If you, O Lord, kept the record of sins, who could stand? But with you, Lord, there is forgiveness. It changes it when we speak it out loud, and especially when we speak it out loud in unison, we're declaring as a community, this is what we stand for. So we become more involved in the Word. So the Psalms were meant to be out loud. The fourth and final, are you kidding me point, is the Psalms are meant to be memorized. Gordon Wenheim, a renowned Old Testament commentator, suggests this, that the Psalms were intended to be memorized, and likely were memorized by previous generations. An idea that we today might find hard to swallow, if not near impossible, but people in the olden days were very good at memorization. For instance, it's widely believed that many of the Romans were able to recite the Aeneid, which is a 10,000-word poem, by memory. In fact, students were often required to memorize it. The same is true for the Greeks in the poems of Homer. Many a Greek student could recite large swaths of the entire collection of Homer's poems, which would be the equivalent in length to the Old Testament. So I know if you've ever wondered what people did before TV and computers, this is what they did. They memorized stuff. And not everyone, of course, could memorize to the same level, of course. In Greece, there were abridged versions of the classics for people to memorize that would be more attainable, like a collection of the best stuff. Memorize this. It's a little easier, even though that very idea was looked down upon by the purists. Which kind of reminds me of the time my friend Dave Vanderboom years ago was very disappointed in me because I bought a best of Bob Dylan album. He was absolutely disgusted. You do not buy a best of Bob Dylan album. You buy every Bob Dylan album. In India, anthologies of Buddhist scriptures were produced for the masses during the early centuries AD. So they took the Buddhist scriptures and they created an anthology for the masses. The Psalms functioned as a type of anthology. When the Psalms were compiled into one work, they were organized into 5 books that correlate with the 5 books of the law. Martin Luther, for instance, also called the Psalms a mini Bible because they encapsulate the redemptive movements of God that we find throughout the Bible. And so the Psalms fit this pattern that we see in antiquity of condensed theology meant to be memorized. And people did memorize the Psalms. This is likely why the Psalms is the most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. The authors of the New Testament, not having access to the written word like we do, could most easily, when they're writing the New Testament, quote the Psalms. Why? Because they had them memorized. Now, this doesn't mean that we must also memorize them, but consider the benefit if we did. Consider the benefit if maybe we didn't have all of them memorized per se, but had a bunch of them memorized or even internalized. We would have access to this treasure trove as we speak to articulate our deepest cries to God. In moments of crisis particularly, we would have words near to the surface. When Jesus was on the cross, in his deepest moment of crisis, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which is only the first line of Psalm 22, but it's widely believed that Jesus cried out the entire Psalm 22. And you can see why people would believe and think that it's the entire psalm that Jesus cried out. I'll just give you a few lines of this psalm so you get the idea. Later in Psalm 22, it says, "I am scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me, and they hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." And later in the Psalm 22, "Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." And the same is true of when Jesus later says on the cross, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." It's Psalm 31. Jesus, in his deepest moment of crisis on the cross, is crying out to God, using the words of the Psalms, these prayers that, because he had them internalized, they were useful for unearthing the deep emotions in this time of crisis. And so this is what I would love for us to aspire toward for the rest of the summer. Not memorize all 150 Psalms, not even memorize the 7 Psalms that we're doing, but to pray the Psalm of the week each day. And maybe by the end of the week, if not memorized, at least internalized. And you'll find the Psalm of the week if you are registered for the daily devotional email. If you're not registered for that, you can contact the church office. And so we're being encouraged to pray the Psalm Wednesday to Wednesday, to internalize the Psalm in the hope that the Psalm will externalize your emotions, to become naked before God and be healed. Put your hope in the Lord, for in him there is deliverance. Let's respond with singing.